Okay, I'm in First Corinthians chapter 7. First Corinthians chapter 7. In First Corinthians chapter 7, Paul again mentions to the church there in Corinth that he's writing this letter to, that he is responding to questions that he was asked. He's responding to situations that he has heard of that are taking place there in the church. And here in chapter 7, he follows up with a few more details. He gets a little bit more specific about the issues related to sexual immorality. In chapter 5, he addresses a specific circumstance of a man having his father's wife, but then he continues and mentions it a little bit more in a greater context with regards to issues that are not related to that specific situation. But here in chapter 7, he is going to respond to questions that were asked of him. We do not know specifically what those questions were because we don't have that letter from them that we can refer to. But we can get a general idea of what they were asking by the answers that he gives. All right, so here in chapter 7, he continues the discussion or the subject of sexual immorality. And he says this is a solution to people engaged in such personal intimacy in a way that God would not desire. All right, that God has designed us as humanity. He has created us in such a way that we would have a desire for such intimacy, for sexual intimacy, that we have this desire that he created us to have. But in addition to that, he created us to fulfill these desires within a specific context. And that context is within a committed relationship between a man and a woman that we would describe as marriage. All right, so that's kind of the general overview of what I'm going to be getting into. So he's responding to questions. Let me just go ahead and read from verse 1 where he says, "Now concerning the things of which you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman." All right, it's good for that not to be the case. Now, this does not mean that it is bad if he does. Okay, and same thing with a woman. All right, it is good for a woman if she does not touch a man, but that does not mean that it is bad if she does. That's not what I see happening here. It's just a way of establishing the fact that if a man does not engage in such activity, then that's okay, that's good. And if a woman does not, then that's good. But if they do, that is also good. Let's just do this in the proper relationship that God defined. God defined marriage, and this was a part of the definition of marriage. And so, yes, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, and it's good for him to do that if it's done in the right situation, in the right context. All right, so that's verse 1, again from verse 1. "Now concerning the things of what you wrote to me, it is good for a man not to touch a woman, so also it is good if he does." What's important to keep in mind is that people do have a desire to do so. All right, and this is a desire that God created us to have. All right, now it's important to also recognize that some people have a greater desire for having such a connection with somebody else than others. All right, it's just the way things are. Some people have a greater desire for this than other people have. Okay, now the problem that usually surfaces from this is that those who do not desire this so much, okay, it's easy for them to criticize those who do. And this follows along with the same idea of the religious pride. It's similar to that in the sense that For those who do not struggle with certain sins, and I'm not saying that this is a sin, I'm just saying that as an example, for those who struggle, who do not struggle so much with certain sins, they can tend to criticize those people who do, all right, through religious pride, where they can say, well, I don't commit those kinds of sins like you do. And that's a form of religious pride that gets developed from within a person. This is very attractive to people to be involved in religion so that they can compare themselves with other people and assert themselves as being greater or of greater importance or a better person, because they can compare themselves with somebody else who struggles or who is tempted by something or may have a desire for something that they don't have much of a temptation for or a desire for at all. All right, so this kind of criticism comes, from a person who generally doesn't have the same kinds of issues and struggles. And this is very attractive, especially in the church, for those who do not have too much of a desire for sexual intimacy. They can find church to be a sanctuary for them and also an opportunity for them to exercise religious pride and assert themselves as being greater than somebody else, because of course within the church we have some restrictions that are related to God's design and God's definition of what relationships should be like. And so it is attractive to people, all right? The church can become a sanctuary for those who don't desire such things so much, okay? And beyond that, they will relate to those who do have such desires greater than they have. They will relate to those people as if they have psychological problems, okay? You desire this a lot, or more than I do? Well, then you have psychological problems. This gets conveyed, okay? This gets conveyed a lot, especially from the church. Now, it also happens out in the world as well, because they have their own systems of law that they function under. Everybody's got some system of law. But in the church, it seems to be somewhat of a sanctuary for this kind of way that people will relate to one another. Okay, and so just because a person has great desire to be close to somebody else in this way, it does not mean that they have psychological problems, all right, or that there's something wrong with them. Okay, but like I said, from those who don't have too much of a desire, that is a common way that they relate to others. Okay, what Paul is presenting here is a solution to the problem. And putting someone to shame, all right, or saying that they have psychological problems or something like that is not going to be a solution to the desires that people have. I mean, what does that mean? You're going to try to find some way to cause damage to somebody so that they don't desire such things anymore? That's the model that some people choose to take. Well, let's hurt this person in whatever way that we need to hurt this person, emotionally, psychologically, relationally, perhaps even with medication, in order to suppress this because we think that this is wrong and evil and that sort of thing, instead of recognizing that this is just part of the design of God, that He created us to have these desires, and it just so happens that some people desire it a little bit more than others. Now, there's, of course, a lot more to say about this in terms of where this should take place, and that's what he is talking about. Now, before I get into this with too much detail, it's important to remember that there is a definition of marriage. And what Paul is describing is a definition of marriage that is consistent with the Mosaic law and is consistent with the creation of God. But this definition of marriage and the way that he approaches this is not the same as the definition of marriage that exists in the world. All right, and throughout the history of humanity, there have been many different definitions of what marriage is. So you have to keep that in mind and understand that Paul presents some ideas here. He explains some things here, and these explanations here in chapter 7 are not going to be compatible with the definitions of marriage that other people have. And so it's important to keep that in mind. That people have got their own ideas, and it's not necessarily going to be consistent. And so as I explain certain things, you will probably be thinking, oh, now that is just not right. That is just not right. And it's probably because you have a different definition of marriage than what I see in the scriptures. And that just has to be understood. So if two people are going to have a successful marriage of some kind, they do need to keep that in mind, that they have to have the same kind of definition of what the marriage is. This is something that has to be discussed in advance. Otherwise, there is a high probability that the marriage will dissolve just because you have two people who have two completely different ideas about what the marriage is. And this will be a great source of conflict, and is a great source of conflict within a lot of marriages. All right, let me go ahead and proceed into verse 2. All right, it is good for a man not to touch a woman. That's the end of verse 1. In verse 2, he says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Okay, this is a definition of marriage. You have one man and one woman bound together in a relationship. Okay, and this is a solution to the concern of sexual immorality. Or at least it's expected to be a solution to this, but many of you probably have discovered that just because a man and a woman get married, that doesn't automatically mean that this is going to be a solution to the desire of such intimacy that it may be fulfilled in such a way that we would not be seeing sexual immorality take place. Okay, just because people get married, that doesn't automatically mean that this is going to be solved. That's another problem, and Paul addresses this in the following verses. Okay, but this has to be understood that the church is very good at doing that. The church will promote the idea of marriage. Hey, listen, if you are desiring such intimacy, well, then get married. And so they get married, and then for various reasons, they don't have the sexual intimacy in the marriage. In many cases, they will be having this much less than they were having such intimacy when they were single, when they were not married. So not only does it not become a solution, but it becomes an additional problem. All right? This is what happens. It happens all the time. It is not unusual. I would expect that you would all, not necessarily have this kind of issue in your own life, but I'm sure you know other people who have this kind of issue. So he says, nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, this is a solution, but, well, because people have different definitions of what marriage is, and because people have different ideas about what the relationship is to be, it does not always become a solution to this. Okay, so he goes on and explains a few more details concerning this. In verse 3, let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. All right, that there is affection due. Okay, that it is something that is in a sense owed to the other person. All right, if you are a wife, then your husband is due affection from you just because of the definition of the relationship. All right? Same thing with the wife. The wife is due affection from her husband by the definition of the relationship. That's what he says right here, verse 3. Okay? That the wife has a responsibility to be affectionate to her husband, and the husband has a responsibility to be affectionate to his wife, just because they exist. All right? Just because that's who they are. Because they exist, because that's who they are, a husband and or a wife, then the other person has a responsibility to be affectionate to the other person, to provide them with affection. All right? We have a desire for affection from somebody else that was created by God. It's a God-created desire within each person to desire the affection of somebody else. A man desires the affection of a woman. The woman will desire the affection from a man. Of course, some more than others. But regardless of what the balance of that ratio may be, it is still a responsibility of the wife to provide her man with affection, and it is a responsibility of the husband to provide the woman with affection. All right, that's just what he says. That if you're going to get married, this is going to be a solution to sexual immorality. We have to include the fact that there is a responsibility. Okay, that there is a responsibility in that regard. The authority is with the other person. All right? I mean, if you have the responsibility to provide affection to someone else, you also have the authority to do that inherently. You have the authority, all that is necessary in order to provide someone with what you have. And you have that, so, don't withhold it from the other person. But there is another measure of authority that the other person has in this relationship. In verse 4, the wife does not have authority over her own body. Okay? Now, she does enough to be able to provide, to fulfill her responsibilities. And so it's stated in a different context, all right, in a different understanding, that the wife does not have authority over her own body, and I'll explain this more in just a moment. But the husband does, and likewise the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Okay, now let me explain this to you in a I think a simple way to understand this. It would be as if the wife, all right, we'll go to the second half of verse 4 first, and then go to the first half. But I think you'll understand the implications of me starting with the second half. It would be as if the wife could say to her husband at any time, all right, during any time of the day, on any day, she could say something that would sound kind of like this. Now, mister, that body of yours over there, that belongs to me. And I desire it right now. And so don't withhold it from me. You had better share, all right, what you've got there, because I desire it and it's mine. All right, so that's what he says, okay, at the end of verse 4, that this is the kind of authority that the wife has over the husband. And the wife does not have psychological problems if she desires her man. All right. In fact, the man should be thankful. You would think that the man would be thankful in some ways and appreciative that she desires him. Okay. That he has a need to be desired, and there you go. You got somebody who actually desires you, and to that extent. Okay. And so when that is the case, then the husband is not to withhold what is hers. He has a responsibility to provide her with whatever she desires. Okay, that's the second half of verse 4. Having said that, I'm sure that you'll find it a little bit easier for me to go to the first half and say that if the husband looks at his wife and says, now, excuse me, miss, But that body of yours belongs to me, and I desire that right now. And so you are not to withhold that from me, but you are to let me enjoy that body of yours, okay, as much as I want, because it's mine. So, I'm going to take it. That is the definition of marriage that Paul is describing as a way to solve the problem of sexual immorality, and also as a way of conveying the definition of marriage as God established it. Okay? Now understand that in saying that, people have different ideas about what marriage is and how people are to relate to one another, to the extent that what I just said concerning verse 4 would be the complete opposite. Okay, the complete and total opposite of what a lot of other people would prefer to believe. All right, so I will acknowledge that people have their own ideas about what these relationships are. I understand. So if you're going to have a relationship with somebody else, it would be a really good idea to have a discussion about these matters beforehand. And of course, you're going to have to hope and pray that the other person is not going to just be dishonest with you and say and just go along. Oh yeah, sure, yeah, no problem. When in reality, the day after you get married, well, no, the definition is not that at all. There's a lot of dishonesty and a lot of manipulation that goes around, and you have to be aware of that. Okay, so that's verse 4. Moving forward into verse 5. Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. Okay, now a simple way of understanding this, especially as it relates to verse 4, is he uses the word consent. All right, which is a way of saying, well, it doesn't mean that the other person cannot respond with something like, is it possible that maybe we could delay this until tomorrow? Would that be okay? And have some consideration, and don't just say, no, that's mine, I want it now. And, you have to work that out, okay? And so it doesn't automatically mean that it's just upon demand no matter what, but allow for consent to say no temporarily for the reasons of perhaps fasting, prayer, maybe just because there are circumstances of life that have overwhelmed you and you just don't think you can do it effectively. There are many polite ways of responding to this kind of situation. So he does say, do not deprive one another except with consent, and only understanding this is for a period of time, and so let them know when that time expires, such as, no, not today, but tomorrow, or the next day, yeah, we'll take care of that, sort of thing. So that's what he introduces here in verse 5. Okay, now he says in verse 6, but I say this as a concession, not as a commandment. All right, the whole thing is in effect a concession with regards to the solution to sexual immorality. Also, the solution to what happens if somebody wants the consent not to do such a thing. All right, but what I think is most important here from verse 6 is that he says that this is not the commandment of God. Okay, Paul is not telling people, thus saith the Lord. That's not what he's saying. He's saying, this is what I have to say about this issue. Okay, about this subject. Based on my understanding, this is my response to the questions and concerns that were raised, that were brought to him. He's saying, okay, well, I got a response. I've got an answer to your questions, but this is not, I'm not saying that this is of God. I'm not saying that this is of the law of God, because it's not. This much detail is not found in the law of God. You can't go to the law that was presented through Moses and find these specific details explicitly given there. Paul is making it clear. Look, I am saying this. This is not a commandment from God. And so you can't read this chapter, read these scriptures, and go to your spouse and quote this to them and say, "Thus saith the Lord," because no, this is what Paul had to say. And I think he's right, but this is not something that we could present from that point of view. We are trying to solve certain problems. Again, from verse 5, "Do not deprive one another except with consent for a time, that you may give yourselves to fasting and prayer and come together again." Right? Come together again. Do it, and do that soon. "So that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." All right? So that Satan or the devil or anybody else, there's going to be temptations. All right? And what is the temptation? The temptation is going to come from some other man for the wife or some other woman for the man who will say, "You know what? I desire you." Okay? Some other woman is going to go to your husband and say, "I desire you." All right? And you probably recently informed him that you don't. And some other woman will, and he's going to be tempted to give into that because he has a sincere desire to be desired, all right, and to engage in this kind of activity as part of that. So also the wife will be tempted by some other man who presents himself to her and says, "I find you to be desirable." And your husband doesn't seem to find you very desirable, and I do, and so let's do this. Okay? And that is something that people deal with. And so you want a solution to that? If you want to ensure that your husband is not going to fall to the temptation of some other woman, well then perhaps you should make sure that he understands that you desire him, and you will fulfill his need to be desired and to have affection, that you'll take care of that, and some other woman won't have a chance. So also with the man, towards the woman, that this is one of the ways to overcome the temptations that happen in the world. Of course, these happen for other reasons besides that, but in this situation and in this context, we can at least talk about this reason why people will engage in sexual immorality even though they are married. All right? Because of your lack of self-control. Now, to say that someone has a lack of self-control, again, you can be tempted to say, "Now look, you have psychological problems because you can't control yourself, enough regarding this. You are giving in to the opportunities and temptations that are available to you. There's something wrong with you." And that's not what it is. He's saying, look, this is a solution to the self-control problem. All right? Do not withhold such from your spouse who has a lack of self-control. Instead, this is how it is to be resolved. There is nothing wrong with a person who desires such a thing so much that they can't exercise enough self-control. That doesn't necessarily mean that. Now, maybe over time, then as a person becomes more mature, then maybe they can exercise self-control better than they were able to before. But that's not the issue. The issue is are these desires being properly fulfilled in the proper context? Not to try to suppress the desires through the shame of how dare you not exercise self-control. All right, that's not the solution. It's just a way of recognizing that this is a factor involved. Okay, so that's verse 5 and 6. Verse 5 and 6. Something else I like to say about this is that when you have a man who desires a woman, or a woman who desires a man, all right, when you have this situation where somebody is desiring someone else, it can be easier for them if they are not around this person. It can be easier for them to be single than it is to be around someone who they desire but withholds intimacy from them. If you have a man who has a wife and he really desires her a lot, he really likes her, and he loves her, and he just really wants to be that intimately close with her. Same thing with the woman who has her husband, and boy, does she really desire her husband. She really likes him. She really loves him, and she just really enjoys being that close to him. If he says no, all right, then it could be better for her if she was single. And the same thing for the husband. If the wife just says no, you're not going to be that close to me, then it can be easier for him to be single rather than to be married. All right, and this is another consideration for what the Apostle Paul says, that it can be good if he just never touches her. It could be good if he doesn't touch a woman, if he's never around them. All right, because just because he has a wife doesn't automatically mean that she's going to participate in his desire for her. All right. Instead, yes, there are women who will look at their husbands and say, "You have psychological problems because you desire me." All right, that's the kind of thing that goes on. If you desire me, well then no. See, the definition that some people have about marriage, especially women in this day and age, and I have counseled 3 generations of people personally, all right, and I've watched this develop. And this is developed. We have a new trend, and it's not necessarily new. It has existed in prior generations as well. Like 100 years ago, there was a lot of this going around, from what I can tell from the books that I read about the relationships that were happening. And so it's not just now and never happened before, but definitely now, over the past 3 generations, there's been this development that women expect to be worshipped and not desired. All right. And like I said, this has been stated before in other places and times, but right now we are in that part of the cycle of history that has its ups and downs, and we're in that area of the cycle where there is an assertion that women are to be worshipped and not desired. A simple way to explain this is to say that if a husband desires his wife, well, then he is evil. How dare he? Because she is to be worshipped, not desired, which means that he is to follow all of her instructions, commands, and orders. All right, to include, if she ever wants any intimacy, then she commends it upon him that he is now to give her intimacy in whatever way that she desires, regardless of his existence as a person, which he's not even a person anyway, so it doesn't factor in. But that the husband exists only to follow the orders, commands, and instructions of the wife, and he is also to bring her tribute. Okay, I mean, that's what it's like. I've watched this develop, and it really has become like that. I've actually heard women actually say that's what they expect of the man who is in their life, that he is to worship her, not desire her, but to worship her in the sense of following her commands and instructions and orders, and he is to provide her with tribute. And that's it. That's his role, And so you really have to consider what are the definitions of marriage that people are really working with, all right, in order to find a way to put this together. But again, in verse 6, he says this is a concession, not a commandment. When you read through chapter 7, you cannot say, "Thus saith the Lord, here it is in the Bible. You must comply with what is written here. It is written." That's not what he says. He says, look, this is what I'm saying in response to the question, to the solution, based on his understanding of the design of God. And I personally think that it is compatible with the design of God just fine, as if God would say it, but there just wasn't a situation where God explicitly said this himself. So you can't say, "Thus saith the Lord." You cannot say this is a commandment. So he goes on in verse 7, and this follows along with the theme of it can be better to be single than to be married. All right? In verse 7, "For I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that." Okay, his own gift from God. Well, it may be a gift from God in the sense that you don't have as much of a desire as someone else, or you may have a stronger ability to exercise self-control than somebody else. With the Apostle Paul, okay, maybe he didn't have so much of a desire for such intimacy. Maybe that's the case. Maybe he was just one of those guys that just didn't desire that so much. He could have also been a person who had tremendous desire, but he also had a tremendous amount of self-control with regards to that desire. So you never really know. A person may have tremendous self-control and no desire. They may have tremendous self-control and a lot of desire, or they may have no self-control and no desire, or no self-control and a lot of desire. All right? You never really know what a person is dealing with. It's an individual situation. And he just says, I would like it for everybody to be like me. Whatever combination that may look like of those two particular items. He says, I think it's fine if everybody's like me, but also he's also allowing for the fact that if people are not like him, it's good also. Okay, "For I wish that all men were even as myself," but he can say, but if you're not, he's okay with that also. All right? "Each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and another in that. But I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am." All right? Even as he is. He is either a widow or unmarried, which means that he was perhaps married before. And his wife died. That could be the case. Married before and he was divorced. All right, there is an allowance for divorce in the law. According to the commands of God, there were circumstances where a woman could divorce her husband, and also circumstances when a man could divorce his wife. That was permitted by God in order to deal with the fact that we are not like him, and we do have a hard heart about certain matters on occasions, and that can cause a significant disruption to the relationship. It doesn't mean that he was never married. In fact, there is a high probability that he was married because he identified as a Pharisee. And as a Pharisee, while Pharisees could have been single and never married, that was not condemned necessarily, but it was expected that if you are going to be a Pharisee, that you are going to be married and you are going to have children. It was expected because of the first commandment of God, to be fruitful and multiply. All right, that was the first commandment of God when he put Adam and Eve together. And so if you are going to obey all of the commandments of God, and Pharisaical Judaism was all about obey all of the commandments of God, then included within Pharisaical Judaism was an expectation that a man would get married, all right, that he would have a wife and that they would have children. That was a part of of being a Pharisee. So if Paul was a Pharisee and was not married, he would have been distinguished as someone who was not in complete compliance with all of the not the Mosaic law, but all of the commands of God. And he would not necessarily be shunned. They could say, well, it's being delayed in some way. That's how it could be approached, of course. But just the idea of him being a Pharisee at all, I would suggest the probability that he was married was relatively high. And he says unmarried or widowed, that would mean divorced or your spouse passed away. And there would be lots of reasons why Paul could have been divorced. I could come up with a lot of reasons based on my understanding of his life as to why his wife wouldn't want to depart from him or why he would want to let go of his wife. But that's just all speculation. We don't have enough information to really know for sure. All right, but again, in verse 7, for I wish that all men were even as I myself, but each one has his own gift from God, one in this manner and the other in that. Verse 8, but I say to the unmarried and to the widows, it is good for them if they remain even as I am. All right, to remain single is a solution to the problem of the other person, your spouse, withholding themselves from you. Okay, it could be easier for you to be single than it could be to be married, because I'm sure many of you know lots of people who are in a marriage and there is not a lot of this kind of intimacy taking place. All right, like I said, I've counseled 3 generations of people, and I'll tell you that this is a common problem that surfaces, very common. And I've, of course, provided a lot of creative and unusual solutions to these matters, but it's not unusual. And in that sense, like I said, it can be easier for a person to stay single because they're not around a person who they desire. Okay, and of course the other person can say, oh, they're not around. Well, of course they're not around. They don't want to be around you so much because they really like you. And if they're around you and they really like you and you say no, that kind of rejection is worse than just being by themselves away from you. All right? Or, just stay single and then deal with it. Can be easier to wrestle with the temptations of sexual immorality than to be married and wrestle with the sexual intimacy problem with your spouse. It can be easier in some ways because you're not around that person so much. All right, continuing into verse 9. But if they cannot exercise self-control, let them marry. For it is better to marry than to burn with passion. Okay, now that's in the situation where people are around one another. If you have a man who's around a woman and they cannot exercise self-control, well, let them marry. It can be better for them if they're not, but if they're around each other and they really like each other, here you go. Do so, but do so in the proper context, which is the marriage. All right, let them marry. It's better for them to marry than to burn with passion. But like I said, you might then get married and burn with passion. It may be even more so, because now you're around this person all the time, and this is not being worked out, and so now you're going to burn with even more passion. This has to be understood because this is what goes on. All right, this really does go on a lot. I have found, as I've watched carefully the last 3 generations develop, that it is now very common to see women marrying a man not for the purpose of building a marriage, but for the purpose of building a divorce. That's a very real issue, and I would say 20 years ago I never even heard of such a thing. But over time, I've discovered that, my goodness, this really is something that has been going on lately, is that tends to be the objective, to build a divorce and not really to build a marriage. And the way that they relate to each other is the wife will relate to her husband in a way that will increase the destructiveness of the marriage in preparation for the eventual divorce that they're working on. All right? And I know this may be blasphemy to suggest such a thing, especially in a church or in a religious context. But folks, it's so overwhelming to see this as being the case, especially with the hundreds of guys that I've talked with who have come to me and have described to me what has been going on in their own life. And I, of course, have had personal experiences that correspond to this also. This is something that some people want to not only ignore, but they get angry because somebody even mentions something like this because of the fear of maybe it's true. Well, I'll tell you, it really is in some situations. And there's just nothing you can do about that, all right? And so getting married to resolve the matter of burning with passion, especially in such an exaggerated situation as that, where the wife is working on a divorce, not really a marriage, oh, you're definitely going to be faced with this one. Absolutely. This is an important part of destroying the relationship and building the best quality divorce situation that you can, all right, to effectively abuse your husband in this way. So the burning with passion, again, we have to remember that there is nothing wrong with someone who has a great sense of passion. Okay, it's not some kind of psychological problem that someone has this deep desire to be passionate with somebody else. Okay, but like I said, that's the way that some people will see others, as if they have some kind of psychological problem. No, it's just because they are different. They're not like you. They are different. People are different. That's just the way things are. Okay, for those of you who are using this for your small groups, I don't have a specific question for this one because, of course, this is one of those topics and subjects that can be a little bit awkward for a lot of people to consider. And so I'm going to ask you, what kinds of questions can you think of to ask concerning 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 9? What kinds of questions can you think of? Not what kinds of questions can I think of, but what kinds of questions can you think of about these issues that I presented? And I'll continue into chapter 7 in the next message. Thanks.